Okay, can people hear me? Okay, thank you. So I am just going to go ahead and dive right in. This is a little bit awkward because I can't see any of you. And so I'm not sure. I can't really read your facial expressions. I don't know if you can hear me or not. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to see the chat as we go. If you all need me to change anything or do anything. Okay. So nice to meet you all. My name is Brianna Johannesson. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at Jefferson Center with the Launch Grant. So, primarily, I do work with young kids and families, but I have a long history of working with school age kids in elementary schools, in integrated care settings. And so I know a lot about working with those school agers. So, the goal of this training, this presentation, is how do we parent happy, successful kids age 6 to 11? So, this is that school age, those school age years. There's a huge difference, right, between age 6 and age 11. But I'll be sharing a lot of just general information with you all today. We'll be talking about a lot of parenting strategies, and some of this will apply to your family, and some of this might not work for your family because there's a large audience today. Everybody is coming at this presentation with different goals, different ideas. Everybody's family is so different. And so really make sure that you're respecting your own family values, your own family culture, and what is important to you all. With that said, I will be talking about a lot of good parenting strategies. I will be talking about a lot of the developmental stages, social, emotional development that your kids are going through right now. And we'll talk about just kind of some general goals for your kids and some strategies for success for them. So strategies for success might be, having them be healthy, functioning members of society, right? All of those things that we really want for our kids. First, just take a moment and think in your head, what do you want for your child? So, like I said, I'm going to be sharing a lot of parenting information today, a lot of strategies, but every family is so different. So just take a second and think in your head, what do I want for my child? And what do I want for my relationship with my child? So you might even want to write this down. So when you think about your kid, for example, 20 years from now, looking back on their childhood, what do you want them to remember about it? What do you want them to say about their relationship with you? As we go through all this information, hopefully this can ground you in what's important to my family, what's important for my kids. So if something doesn't feel like it fits with you, then maybe that's not the strategy that you try. But I do want you to think about maybe, having one or two takeaways from this session tonight and having one or two things that you really hold on to and you want to try at home with your kids, but with this grounding idea of what do I want for my child? What do I want for our relationship? A lot of us were raised very differently from how we want to raise our kids. So that's also helpful to keep in mind as we go through all of this information is, what did my caregivers or my parents do when I was growing up? And what do I want to do that's the same? And what do I want to do that's different? So, first, let's talk about understanding your child's development. Understanding where your child is at in their development is so helpful as a baseline for any kind of parenting strategy or any kind of plan you're going to come up with your kids. Because if we know where our children are at developmentally, that helps us to set realistic expectations because we know what our kids can be expected to do. So we know that they have the skills to meet our expectations, which is really important in being successful in setting those expectations. Understanding their development also helps children to meet those goals. If we can understand where our kids are at developmentally, then we can be more mindful about what skills do they need to really bolster in order to meet the goals that we have for them. And understanding your child's development can help you connect with your children more effectively. So, if you notice that your child has a certain behavior that is maybe annoying but developmentally appropriate, maybe you can be more mindful about meeting them where they're at instead of getting frustrated with that behavior. For example, I have a toddler at home and he sometimes hits and he sometimes bites, which are behaviors that would be much more frustrating if I didn't understand that they were typical developmental behaviors. So Erickson has these stages of psychosocial development, and every what Erickson did, and people are very, people respect this information and use it a lot. This is I don't know when he created this, but it's been around forever. Uh, on the left is the approximate age of the child, and on the right is the psychosocial crisis, as they say, that the child is going through at that age. So, for example, if you look at the infant to 18 months, that's trust versus mistrust. And really, what the child is learning in terms of their psychosocial development at that phase is how do I trust people who will get my needs met, right? So every age has a very important milestone that kids are trying to meet. And this 5 to 13 years is really where we are falling. And that is industry versus inferiority. And the main goal of this stage is competence. So during these years, the main goal that kids have is to become competent human beings. So they are becoming more mature, they're doing things on their own, they're becoming more self-aware. They're entering school, so they're getting a lot of school-based information, learning about logical reasoning. We also see in this age that there's kind of a shift. Kids enter school and the peer group becomes really important in establishing their self-esteem. They're really trying to get approval through activities they're doing. Kids might start to get competitive. They might compare themselves to other kids. And we see that their self-esteem is really tied to this performance on tasks. So if you think about all of these tasks that kids are trying to accomplish at this age, you can really see that kids are trying to figure out who they are, what they're good at, what they're not good at. They're comparing themselves to others. And the main goal is that they come out of this feeling really confident and competent. So you might see kids at this age coming home and saying, I was the fastest kid in my gym class, or I did the worst on my math test. I'm the dumbest kid in my class. And those are very developmentally appropriate things to say when you know that the main goal of this stage is being competent at something. And through that process, they're really comparing themselves and measuring their achievement based on tangible tasks. So, as parents, if we can encourage and reinforce these behaviors, then kids' self esteem tends to go up. But if we don't praise and encourage their initiative during this stage and their desire to gain competence in all these different ways, then we might end up with kids who are full of self-doubt, who really question themselves, and who might feel inferior because that's the main part of this stage. Another thing to keep in mind is that Just because the goal of this stage is competence doesn't mean it's not okay for your kids to fail. That is all part of this stage, right? So sometimes your kid's going to fail their math test. Sometimes they're not going to be the best at the sport they're playing. And that's okay. Kids don't need to be the best at everything. The goal is more that they are trying to figure out their self-worth and they're trying to see where they stand, what they're good at, and that's just how they're kind of rating their own self-esteem and comparing themselves to others. These next couple slides are kind of adding to that information. So we had the psychosocial stages by Erickson, and this is a little bit different because it's part of psychosocial development, but it's also just talking about some of the most important tasks of this age range. So these are all developmental tasks that kids are going through. And as you'll go through this list, you'll see that there is so much that kids are dealing with at this age. They're entering school for the first time, they're progressing through school, they're going into middle school. There's just so much going on. So it's, I think, helpful for parents to just know how much kids are juggling in those little brains of theirs so that we can be more empathetic to some of the struggles that they might be having. So, the 12 important tasks: one, sustaining self esteem, right? No easy feat in itself. The next two are being liked and accepted by peers, but also finding the balance between being liked and being different. So, kids want to fit in and they want other kids to like them. It's natural for kids to want to be a part of the group. But also part of this stage is finding things that set them apart and finding ways that they are unique and different, which is really challenging to do. Number 4 is finding acceptable role models for the future. Number 5 is beginning to question the values and beliefs of the family. And number 6 is earning a position of respect within the family. So they're trying to figure out, who do I look up to? What do I believe? What do I value? And then they're turning around and saying, do I value the things that my family values? So your kids might be asking things like, I don't want to go to church. Why do we go to church on Sundays? Or why do we go see this family member? Why do I have to speak Spanish at home? Right? Your kids are probably questioning a lot of values that you hold true and that you raise them with, but they're trying to figure it out for themselves. So sometimes that feels like they're being like against the family, but that's all part of the development of figuring out who they are. And then the flip side, earning a position of respect within the family. So even if they disagree with the family values, a lot of kids are trying to figure out, yeah, but where do I fit into my family and why am I a valued member of this family? So you're starting to see all the nuances of what they're trying to figure out in their development. Next, we have exploring independence, testing limits, right? I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this with your kids. They're trying to figure out, who am I? Where's the line? How hard can I push on the line? What do I get in trouble for? What do I not get in trouble for, right? They're acquiring a lot of knowledge, they're mastering new skills, but they're also trying to accept where they're at in terms of their ability. So they're trying to accept maybe things that they're not good at and they wish they were. They're trying to come to terms with how they look, and they're looking at other kids and seeing what other kids look like. They're dealing with multiple fears, right? Going out onto their own, developing their own friend groups and doing their own thing at school. They're apart from you a lot more than they used to be. Taking control of drives and desires, number 11, is talking about, learning impulse control and trying to figure out, what do I want and how do I get it in a way that's socially appropriate. And then number 12, develop a realistic sense of self, right? No big deal. But if you look at all the previous ones, you can tell how much kids are really focusing on developing their sense of self. Who am I? Who am I going to be? Who am I in relation to the people that I care about? Okay, so I know I went through that pretty quickly, but it feels really important to, before we get into some of this parenting and strategies and, creating routines, rules, also building your relationship with your kids, all of that we're going to talk about next. First, it just feels really important to remind ourselves where our kids are at developmentally at this age so that we can be appropriate in the next steps that we take. So, if you're still with me, just take a deep breath. And then we are going to talk about parenting. So, this next slide um, is was just like a very silly, sarcastic website I found called romper.com. And it talks about the challenges of having a school age child. So, if you have a school age child, you may be familiar with some of these things. So, the first one is social politics. And that means, the social politics of being in school and figuring out, the popular kids and what group do I fit in and what do I have to do at school to be cool, right? Another challenge is so many activities, all of the extracurricular activities. You might be driving your kids all over the place. You're so busy. You might not have time to think about a lot of parenting stuff. And that's very common at this age. Having to answer increasingly complex questions. Oh, I'm getting some weird having to answer increasingly complex questions. So when your kids were little, they were asking why? And now they're probably asking you harder questions and you're trying to figure out how to answer them. Kids at this age start developing a lot of opinions. Kids can be really opinionated during school age years. I think I hear someone with their dog barking. So if you want to go ahead and mute. Also at this age, you're dealing with, fashion battles. This kind of goes into the social politics. Kids are trying to figure out, who am I? What's cool? What's not cool? So they're trying to figure out, what do I wear? What do I want to look like? Being stuck in between ages. This is a perfect age, um, not a perfect age, but this is the kids at this age are notorious for being stuck in between being older adults, teenagers, and being little kids. So they might go back and forth on that. So one day they want to be really grown up. They want to go somewhere by themselves, walk to the store. And then the next day they want to be little again. They want extra hugs, or they don't understand why they have to do so many chores because they're so little and it's so hard, right? They're really stuck in between these very, they're stuck in between having a lot of independence and having a lot of autonomy, and not having much independence and not having much autonomy. The next one is said was stupid trends, which just made me laugh because the picture on the website was someone with a fidget spinner. But you're, noticing your kids be interested in things that you're like, why do you want to do that, right? When I was little, it was like pogs. And I'm sure my parents didn't understand that. This is also peak marketing susceptibility. So commercials are completely targeting your kids right now. They are trying to get your kids to buy certain things and get you to buy certain things. Then you have the fundraisers, right? The school fundraisers that keep coming home with you. No longer having a huge physical advantage. So that means, like, when your kids were really little, you could kind of pick them up and put them in the car, right? But now you can't just pick your kids up and put them where you want them to go. You have to figure out a strategy to get them there, and that can be really challenging. And the last one is bringing home new ideas. So this is just as kids develop their own sense of self, their own opinions and values, they're bringing that information home to you. And they might be saying, hey, I have a new idea, something we should do differently. So when you look at all these challenges, you see again, talking about all of the changes that these kids are going through developmentally. But it also shows you why parenting gets really challenging at this age because you're dealing with your kid being more independent for the first time and going out and being on their own. But you're also trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I parent them at a distance then? Because you don't become a less of a parent just because they're not with you quite as much, right? So are trying to figure out that balance between how do I get all that good parenting in while also helping my kid to be super independent, which is not easy. So before we go into more like parenting strategies and skills and things like that, first take a few seconds and think about what are you doing well. I'm sure that you're doing some awesome things with your kids. First of all, you're here at a training to talk about parenting, which is amazing. So think about something that you're doing well that you really want to just give yourself a pat on the back for. Like, you know what? I am just rocking healthy meals at dinner time. I am just rocking having game night with my kids. Think of one thing that you're doing well and write it down. And as we're going through this training, if you start feeling overwhelmed or you start shoulding yourself, I should do this, I should do this, I should do this more, I should do this less. I want you to think back on this one thing that you know you are doing well because that is so important. These are kind of the four main parenting styles. So there's a lot on this slide. So let me explain what this is. The line going from the top to the bottom is high to low on behavioral control and demandingness. So if you are high, like towards the top, that means you are exhibiting a lot of control on your children's behaviors with rules and limits and structure. You your goal as a parent is to have a lot of behavioral control. And low is you don't really have much control. You don't have a lot of rules. You don't have a lot of limits. That's really not your priority as a parent. And then this line that goes from left to right, on the left you have low, and on the right you have high, and that is responsiveness, warmth, and supportiveness. So if you're on the low side of things, you are not super warm with your kids. Maybe you believe, kids should be seen and not heard. You're just not really interested in having that strong relationship with them. Versus on the right side, high warmth and supportiveness is that you really value the relationship with your kids and you're very warm with them. You might be more likely to give hugs and just have fun and um, you really value that relationship aspect with your kids. So I'll go through the different styles of parenting, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about where you think you are, where you want to be, so we can kind of use that going forward. The top left is authoritarian. So as you can see from the lines, authoritarian parenting is very high on behavioral control and demandingness and very low on warmth and responsiveness. These are the parents who are very structured, but then when kids ask questions, they say, don't question me. It's because I said so. This is just the way that it is. I'm the parent. I make the rules. I'm the boss, it says. These parents are more likely to have lots of consequences, maybe a lot of punishments, very rigid, and they really value obedience. They want their kids to be very obedient. So, of course, within all of these boxes, there's a lot of variations. And so, what I'm explaining is kind of the most extreme aspect of that parenting style. The next one, the bottom left, is uninvolved. So, this is low responsiveness and warmth and low behavioral control. These are the parents who are just kind of uninterested. They're distant, they're passive. These are usually the parents that we see if a child is neglected, for example, because there were no limits, there was no rules, but there also was no warmth or love in their house. And so uninvolved parents are really just kind of checked out altogether. The next one, bottom right, is permissive. So this is very warm and supportive, but very low on behavioral control. These are the parents who say, I don't like to have rules. I just want to be my kid's best friend. They might be over involved in their kids' lives because there's not a lot of boundaries. Um, they maybe let their kids call the shots. There's just no rules in the house, lenient. So, as you can see, these parents really value the relationship at the cost of setting limits and having structure at home. And then top right is authoritative. So authoritative parenting, and again, there's a huge spectrum of what this looks like, but authoritative parenting is usually where we see the best outcomes for kids. So every kid is different and every kid responds differently to different parenting styles, but generally what we see with authoritative parenting is those better outcomes. Authoritative parenting has high control and high warmth. So these are the parents who have lots of rules and structure and expectations for their kids, but they also have a lot of warmth and they value the relationship with their kids. So these parents are really wanting to develop a strong relationship and connection with their kids so that they can have structure and limits and it's not at a cost to the relationship with the kids because both is really important. So before we move on, think about where you would put yourself on this graph. So if you are in front of your computer, just put your finger like where you would put your own parenting on this graph. And then think about where do you want your parenting to be? Maybe you want to stay exactly where you are. Maybe you feel like you're doing great. Maybe you want to move up or down on the behavioral control, or maybe you want to move left or right on the warmth. So just think about where you want to move your finger. Like, what kind of parent do you want to be? And then after you do that, I want you to think about who raised you, who your caregivers were, and where would you put them on this graph? So some of you might say, oh no, like my caregiver is exactly like me. And it might feel like you're not moving your finger very far. Some of you might say, oh my goodness, I'm doing things completely different from how my caregivers did it. So you might realize that your finger jumps quite a bit. Another way to think about authoritative parenting is by looking at a parenting pyramid. So this particular one is through Incredible Years. Incredible Years is a group that I do Incredible Years groups, but they have a ton of different groups for every age kid, but they're parenting groups for the most part. And the idea of the parenting pyramid, which is very well researched, is that you should be spending most of your time on the bottom of the pyramid because it's the bigger part of the pyramid and that's why it doesn't fall over. And as you go up, those are things that you should be doing less because it's the top of the pyramid and so it's smaller. The reason why this explains authoritative parenting is because at the bottom of the pyramid are all of those connection building, development fostering skills that help kids to develop in a good way and develop their relationship with you. So if you can see this pyramid, it might be a little bit too small on your screen, but the bottom of the pyramid has all kinds of things like talking to your kids, listening to your kids, problem solving, play, paying attention to them, having empathy for them. And the skills that we're building on the bottom of the pyramid are problem solving, cooperation, self esteem, attachment. So the bottom of the pyramid isn't only your relationship development with your kids, but it's also helping your kids to learn skills that they need and for them to feel confident in themselves and to have all of that good, um, be able to have positive relationships with people because they've developed a good attachment with you. Then as you go up the pyramid, the next one we have is, praising good behaviors and encouraging them and coaching them, rewarding them when they do well. And this helps them develop skills, right? So it helps them develop social skills, thinking skills, it helps their motivation to do well. So in this part of the pyramid, we're trying to think about what behaviors do we want to see more of from our kids and how do we foster that? As you keep going up the pyramid, the next one is limits, rules, then we get into consequences, right? So this is teaching kids responsibility, predictability, obedience. But you'll notice that this part of the pyramid is smaller. And the reason for that is because if we are building all of these good skills for our kids, and then we're praising them and encouraging them to engage in positive behaviors, the idea is that we don't have to spend as much time with limits and rules and consequences because we've developed such a good relationship with our kids and we've taught them what we want to see from them. As you go up the pyramid, now we have ignoring, distraction, all of those consequences. So now the bottom three of the pyramid are how do we increase positive behaviors with kids? And the top two are how do we get rid of some of those negative behaviors? But again, the idea is if you've spent enough time developing those good skills and relationships with your kids, you won't have to spend as much time on the top of the pyramid. So I know this is very simplistic in terms of looking at your parenting, but something that just always tends to be true is that the parents who are spending a lot of time at the top of the pyramid and spending a lot of time thinking about rules and consequences and what do I do with this difficult behavior, usually there's something missing on the bottom of the pyramid. And that doesn't always mean that the parent didn't do something right. It just means that there's something that your child is struggling with on that bottom part of the pyramid. And so instead of focusing more on consequences, what we want to do instead is figure out what's behind the behavior and what's the skill deficit that we need to build up. All right, I hope you all are still with me because I can't see you and I haven't gotten any chat notifications. So I'm just going to keep plugging through. But feel free to take a break if you need to, or if you want to come to the Q&A at 8:30, I'll be there as well to talk about more of this stuff. So this slide is a lot of qualities of positive parenting. So we could spend this whole training on just this slide. So I'm not going to go through all of these things, but this is kind of just a different way to state the things that we've just talked about on the previous two slides. So this slide is talking about all of the different qualities that are incorporated in positive parenting. So both the bottom of the pyramid skills and the top of the pyramid skills. One thing I want to say before we go into some of these qualities is that positive parenting does not mean permissive parenting. So as we saw on that slide with the different parenting styles, when we talk about being positive in our parenting with kids, we're not sacrificing rules and limits and consequences. We're just doing it at the same time as we're growing our relationship with our kids. So keep that in mind. I will pick out a few of these that we can talk about a little bit more. And then some of them you can just kind of hang on to. So, for example, mutual respect means having mutual respect between you and your kids. Unconditional love, right? So some of these are self-explanatory, but one thing I'll pick out, for example, is active listening. Active listening is a strategy to use with your kids to help with good communication, right? And active listening is a way of communicating with your kids that communicates, I hear you, I'm with you, I totally understand what you're talking about. Sometimes this means that you agree with what your kid is saying, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you don't agree with what your kid is saying, but that's not the point of active listening. The point of active listening is just communicating that you heard your kid and you want to know more about what they're talking about. So this is that whole like listen and validate strategy. So if your child comes home and says, I got in trouble today at school because I threw my pencil at the teacher. If you are actively listening to your kid, you're asking like, why? Why'd you do that? What was going on? What were you thinking about before you threw it? Why did you decide to throw it? So you're asking questions, and then you might say, okay, I think I get it. You were in class, you wanted your classmates to laugh, so you took your pencil, you threw it at your teacher, and then you got in trouble. Okay, I got it. By actively listening to your child, you're not saying, oh, yeah, that's okay that you threw your pencil at the teacher. Totally fine, right? That's not what active listening is. It's just saying that I hear you and I care about what you have to say about the situation. Another one that I want to pull out is structure. So, structure is super, super important when we're raising our kids. And we saw that on the slide with all the parenting styles, right? The authoritative parenting does have a lot of structure. So, what structure means, part of it is having things like household rules and having behavior charts and schedules and all of those really cool tools for having structure. But maybe your family doesn't like to do that, and that's fine. Really, the idea behind structure is making sure that your kids know what to expect from their environment and they know what to expect from you. So you might do that in a lot of different ways depending on what feels good for your family. But really, kids do best when they know what to expect from. Also, in terms of their relationship with you, having structure means that they know that they can expect a consistent response from you. That doesn't mean that you don't lose it every once in a while, and that's fine. You apologize and you move on, right? Everybody deserves a redo. But structure means that you, as the parent, are able to be regulated and calm enough to have consistent responses in your parenting. So if your child does something one day and they get a response from you, it's likely that the next day they have that behavior, they get the same response. And this is in terms of negative behaviors and positive ones, right? So if you're a parent who struggles with mental illness, for example, perhaps there's some days that you're just feeling really low and really depressed. And so some days if your kids come in and want a hug from you and you're so excited and you give them a hug back, and other days they come in and want a hug from you and you're just not there, right? You don't have the energy. You just don't feel like being touched by anybody. That What that means for kids is that your responses to them aren't as consistent. And again, there's always a redo. There's always a way to go back and say, hey, I just wasn't feeling great yesterday. I want a hug now. And that speaks volumes to kids because it shows that we can apologize and move on. But the idea behind the relationship structure is that even if you have an off day, for example, and you don't respond consistently, you apologizing or talking to your kids about that shows them, yes, that wasn't a consistent response and this is why. And so your kids keep learning, okay, well, usually when I want to give my parent a hug, they'll give me a hug back. That's consistent. Another thing I want to say before we go on to parent self regulation is just touching on this unconditional love quality. And that sounds beautiful, right? Unconditional love for your kids. But really, the important thing is that you find time to just really enjoy your kids and have fun with them. Because if you think about that question I asked you in the beginning of what do you want your kids to remember? What do you want them to say about their relationship with you? A lot of times, what kids remember are the times that their parents were silly with them and, took them on a spontaneous trip somewhere and they just had a lot of fun and they bonded. So I'm hoping that you all are feeling my hope for you is that you're feeling confident enough about parenting strategies that you're able to focus on those really fun, silly relationship building moments with your kids because I don't want that to get lost in that on this presentation that those moments are so 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 important too. Is just being there with your kids, being present, playing games, having fun, kind of putting all of this stuff out the window for a minute so that you can just be there and be having fun, having good quality fun time with your kids. So let's talk a little bit about parent self-regulation. So when you are thinking about, we're going to be talking a little bit more about limits and consequences because I know that's something that parents ask for a lot. But it's important when we're thinking about this positive parenting to be thinking about your own ability to regulate. Because, first of all, it's really hard to set limits and follow through on limits when you're not feeling in control of your body. If your kid is doing something that really sets you off, right? It's important to be able to regulate yourself enough to handle that situation calmly, or else you completely lose control of the situation. And being able to regulate yourself sets an amazing example for your kids because if you're able to say, you know what, this is really frustrating and I'm feeling really stressed out right now. I need to take like 3 minutes to be by myself. Just take some deep breaths, and then I'll come back and have this conversation with you. What that teaches your kids is I can handle negative emotions. I know what to do with them, and I'm still in control of this situation right here. So it's okay to need a break to regulate yourself because that's what we want kids to do, right? We want kids to be able to say, you know what? I'm feeling really out of control of my body right now. I need to do something to get back in control and to help have more calm feelings in my body. So, in the interest of modeling parent self regulation, I would love to do just a brief mindfulness activity with you. Uh, so, I'm just going to walk you through a body scan, which is really just touching base with different parts of your body just to kind of see where you're at. And this is something you can do pretty quickly if you're in the moment and you're like, oh, how am I feeling right now? What's my capacity to deal with the situation? Some kind of body scan is a nice way to start. So if you feel comfortable, just close your eyes, or you can kind of soften your gaze and look down and get comfortable in your chair. And first, just take like 3 deep breaths just to ground yourself wherever you're sitting. So, as I said, I'm going to walk you through just a brief body scan. So, start at your feet. We're not changing anything right now. We're not trying to bring a ton of relaxation. We're just checking in with how our body feels. So, think about your feet. Your feet do a lot for you throughout the day. So, just see how they're feeling. Are they cold? Are they warm? Then move up to your legs. How are your legs feeling right now? Are you sitting? Are you standing? Maybe you can feel them well, maybe you can't. Just check in with how they're doing. Next, check in with your hips. How are your hips feeling right now? Next, we'll go to your stomach. Just check in with how your stomach's feeling. Are you hungry? Are you full? Are you anxious? And then as you go up, you'll check in with your chest and see how your heart is feeling. If it's beating quickly, if it's beating slowly. See what kind of feelings you have going on. Then next we'll go to your arms. Check in with your arms, how they're feeling. Then go down to your hands. Are your hands warm? Are they cold? Are they holding something? Are they relaxed? So we'll check in with your neck and your shoulders. Check in with any tension that's being held there. Just thank your neck for holding your head up all day. And lastly, check in with your head. Just see what your face is doing. Is your face clenched up or is it relaxed? Do a quick scan of what you're thinking in your head. What kind of thoughts are going around up there? If you're distracted today, or if you're feeling really ready to learn. And then when you're ready, just take a deep breath and come back. So that was just kind of a brief example of a way that you might help yourself regulate or something that you might teach your kid to do in terms of regulating. So that might be something that you try with them before they go to sleep at night, or if you notice that they're feeling really wound up or something, you might guide them through like checking in different parts of their body and seeing what they need. Okay. So now that you're all very relaxed, we will talk about setting limits, which is always very fun. So when we are setting limits with kids, and we're going to talk about limits, we'll talk a little bit about consequences. One strategy that I like a lot is through Devro, the Center for Resilient Children, and the website is on the slide, and it's called Flip It. This is something that I teach to teachers in schools often because it's a quick and easy way to remember, a great way to set a limit. So flip it stands for, well, the flip stands for feelings, limits, inquiries, and prompts. So this is a great way to remember how to set effective limits with your kids. Feelings is validating, listening, and trying to figure out what's behind the behavior that happened. So this is that active listening skill that we saw on the slide previous. Limits is just restating what the limit is, right? Being really clear, consistent. You'll notice in setting the limit, there's not a lot of explaining why we're doing this, why I set this limit, what's the reasoning, right? Because kids usually want to know that. The idea of setting effective, one of the ideas of setting effective limits is that you're having these conversations with your kids pretty often. So they're involved in the limit setting at home. And what I mean by that is you're talking with your kids, you're finding really calm, positive moments to sit down and talk with your kids about maybe a behavior plan that you're going to try with them. And you're getting their buy-in, right? Because if you don't have their buy-in, it's probably not going to work well. So you might sit down with your kids when they're really calm and say, you know what? You know how Sometimes at this time of the day, you get really frustrated and you yell at me. And then I get upset and I yell back at you and we end up in an argument and it just doesn't feel good, right? Usually your kids will know that time of day and they'll be like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And you'll say, I want to try something different. If I notice that you're yelling, I'm going to remind you to use your quiet voice. And if you don't, this is what we're going to try. And maybe the this is what we're going to try part is a coping skill. Or maybe it's taking a timeout in their room. Maybe it's, a timeout or a time in, whatever you call it in your family. Maybe it's going outside and exercising. But you're talking to your kids about this when they're calm, they can be a part of the decision making. So then when the behavior does come, your kids know what to expect because they've talked with you about it. So that's why in the moment where you're setting the limit, you don't have to go into all this explanation because you did that before. So if you're setting the limit and your kids are asking, why, right? You can say, we talked about this. This is the limit. And you can explain it to them again after if they forgot. But in the moment that you're setting the limit, what we want to avoid is the power struggle, right? And getting into all of the arguments and then they don't follow what you're saying and then you end up punishing something else, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. So, first, feelings, validate, listen, figuring out what's behind the behavior, restating the limit, and then inquiries is encouraging the child to think of solutions. So, this is the limit. You can't do XYZ. So, what are we going to do instead? So, inquiry is where you're encouraging problem solving with your kids and you're trying to figure out since I can't do this one thing that I want to do, what am I going to try instead? And then followed up with prompts. So, prompts is just continuing that problem solving conversation and figuring out, like, okay, maybe it didn't go so well this time. We tried that new plan with setting that limit and it didn't work. What are we going to change for next time? So, prompts is helping your kids to be continuously involved in this conversation of what they do when they don't like a limit that's set, how they're going to help you set limits at home, what skills they need in order to meet that limit, etc. So if we think about some kind of example, maybe what happened is your child was at school and they were getting teased, and so they hit a kid on the playground. So if you're thinking about setting limits, this would be more of an example for a teacher, but it might happen, in your backyard if there's kids over your house. Feelings would be, okay, what's behind the behavior? So you might say, oh man, you were getting teased by your friend and you're really mad. So what you did was you hit them. Setting the limit would then be, but we don't hit, right? We don't hit when we're mad. Inquiries would be, okay, so what do we do instead? And then prompting is, what do we do next time? So if we're thinking of more of maybe an older example, we might be thinking about a 10-year-old who screams when it's time to clean their room and they just get really upset about that. They don't want to do it. They start yelling. They might call you names. So hopefully you've had a conversation with them ahead of time of, okay, next time you scream, we're going to do something different, right? Maybe you're going to help them listen to a song that helps them calm down and then you'll talk with them again. So you might say, okay, I hear you. I hear you're really mad. You don't want to do what I just asked you to do. But remember, we talked about not yelling. We talked about using a quiet voice. So how do I get you to use that quiet voice? Or maybe your inquiry is, okay, so why don't you go listen to music, come back, and then we'll have this conversation. So does that make sense how you're validating what's going on, you're setting the limit, and then you're helping them to think of an alternative behavior? Because setting limits isn't just rules are rules, you just have to do what I say, right? The idea of setting limits is that you're teaching your kids the positive behaviors that you want to see. So if you're just setting a limit and you're kind of like, nope, rules are rules, that's it, you're not teaching your kids what to do after that. So maybe it is a consequence. Maybe they get something taken away from them. And then the prompt can be, okay, I know that you didn't like that I took that away. What are we going to do next time so that you do use your quiet voice or you do use your safe hands? So prompts is, what skill are you missing that we can work on so that this goes better next time? You'll also notice as we're talking about this, we're not saying you were bad, right? You didn't listen, you failed. We're labeling the very specific behavior that the kid has, and we're not labeling the child themselves. Curious Parenting has a lot of really cool resources, and this one is on setting limits, and this one is, aimed kind of towards younger kids. But the idea of this is that you're looking for a positive opposite for the behavior when you set limits. So what happens is it takes us longer to process negative emotions than it does to process positive ones. And I'm sure you've noticed with your kids over time when you say, don't do this, those are the behaviors that they do, right? Because what you pay attention to is what tends to grow. When you're setting limits, then we want to think about the positive opposite behavior. So, in this one, for example, no running, the positive opposite is walk slowly. This is important because it teaches kids what you're looking out for, and it reminds yourself too, right? It reminds you what you're looking out for. So in the example we were saying before, don't yell might be use a calm voice, or don't hit might be use safe hands or use your words instead of your hands. So whenever you're thinking about a behavior that you're trying to work on with your kids, it's really helpful to first think of the positive opposite behavior that will hopefully take the place of the negative one. We're not going to talk a ton about consequences today, but I did want to talk about some of the most effective consequences that you can give, especially for this age range. And this slide just talks about the difference between a natural consequence and a logical consequence. Both of these are really helpful if you're trying to figure out a consequence for a behavior because they make sense. The idea of natural and logical consequences is that they make sense based on the behavior that the child did. So a natural consequence is something that you as the parent don't necessarily decide. It just kind of happens. So your child, say your child, one of their chores is to put their dirty clothes in the washing machine. A natural consequence might be, your child doesn't put their clothes in the washing machine, and so their favorite outfit is not clean for picture day. So they have to go to school in a different outfit because they did not put their clothes in the wash. They might still get mad at you for that, but that's a natural consequence. You didn't necessarily set that consequence. It's just something that happened naturally based on their behavior. A logical consequence is a consequence that you as the caregiver decides, but it fits perfectly with what the child did. So sometimes when parents are really stuck in some difficult behaviors, they give consequences that are too big. And so kids have no hope of getting back their privileges. So they might say, you're grounded for 3 weeks. And kids are like, 3 weeks is forever, right? There's no way to try to earn back time because that just seems like such a big punishment that they just lose all hope. A logical consequence is something that makes a lot of sense and the kids can understand why they got that consequence. And so, therefore, it's easier to figure out how they can behave in a different way to earn back. So, for example, your child gets really angry. Maybe there's someone who throws things when they're angry. And so they throw their phone at the wall because they're really angry at someone. And so you say, okay, I'm taking your phone away for the rest of the day. That's a logical consequence because they threw the phone and so you took the phone. It's not, they threw their phone and so they never get to play soccer again, right? That wouldn't be a logical consequence because it doesn't match the behavior. Sometimes it's really tricky to think of logical consequences to your kids' behavior because they throw a lot at you, right? And sometimes it can be a struggle to figure out what's an appropriate consequence and what's a consequence that your kid cares about, right? Sometimes parents set consequences and the kid's like, I don't care. So I just want to acknowledge that this is much easier said than done, but it's helpful to keep this in mind. Am I letting my kids have natural consequences when appropriate? And when I have to set the consequences, even if they're not directly related, are they as logical as possible so that my kid is making a very clear connection between the behavior that they did and the punishment that they had? All right, so if you all want to take a couple minutes and think of your own example, one thing that's really helpful in managing behaviors is having a very clear plan. So I'm sure all of you have some sort of challenging behavior that you struggle with your kids because it would be abnormal if you didn't. So first, maybe you want to take a piece of paper and write this down. First, identify the challenging behavior. Try to be as specific as possible. So for example, lack of respect is a very broad behavior. We want to be as specific as possible when we're talking about behavior plans with our kids. So if it is, a lack of respect, what does that mean? What particularly are you trying to work on first? Maybe it's, using bad words. Maybe it's not listening the first time after you ask them to do something. So try to be as specific as possible. And then after you identify the challenging behavior and you're being as specific as you possibly can, what is the positive opposite behavior? So, what is the behavior that will take its place? This is important not only so that your kids know what you want to see from them, but it's important because when you're starting a behavior plan, if you're trying to extinguish one behavior, you need to be able to praise when they make a good decision and have the positive behavior. Because if you're only focusing on distinguishing a negative behavior, it's very likely that a different negative behavior will pop up. Because kids will try to get attention from you in any way that they can. And that's not a manipulative thing, that's just a developmental thing. Whatever kids are getting attention for, even if it's negative, they'll take negative over none any day. So if you're trying to get rid of a negative behavior, at the same time, you should be really praising and paying a lot of attention to the positive behavior when your child does that. So you've identified the challenging behavior, you're thinking of the positive opposite. The next step is what is your plan next time your child engages in the challenging behavior? This part's really tricky too, because say your challenging behavior is my kid will not clean their room, they leave messes everywhere, and the positive opposite behavior is cleaning their room. Well, how often do you want your kid to clean their room? when is this behavior not okay and when is it okay? So if you think about your plan and you want to praise your kid whenever they're engaging in this cleaning room behavior, you need to think as the parent, okay, well, when am I going to check? When do they have to clean their room? Or is it that I want them to listen the first time I ask them to clean their room? So you have to do a lot of prep work, right? To figure out how to make this plan sustainable. Because when you sit down with your kid and you explain, listen, this is the behavior I want to work on with you, and this is the behavior I want to see, then you need to have a good plan of this is how we're going to do it. This is how I'm going to follow through, and this is how I'm going to praise when you do well. So when you're thinking of your plan, think about when this might happen. If this is a behavior that's maybe okay in some situations, but not okay in other situations, how often you're going to be looking at this behavior plan. All of those are very important questions to ask. If your goal for your child is to have a calm voice, is that just at the dinner table? Is that just inside? Is that just during certain times of the day when you're working at home? So just think about all of those things. Then step 3, how will you talk to your child about this plan? So as I mentioned before, it's so important for kids to be a part of this process so that when you set the limit in the moment, they're not taken aback and saying, "Why? This isn't fair," right? If your kid's involved in this behavior planning, and of course, you as the parent still have the final say and you're still the one who's in control of the situation. But if you can get them involved, you're much more likely to have their buy-in and it's much more likely to go smoothly. Because if you talk to your child about, okay, here's the difficult behavior, here's what I want to see more of, let's try this. Next time you do this positive behavior, then we will get to go to the movies that weekend, or we'll get to have your favorite dessert that day. But if you engage in this negative behavior, this is the consequence. Your child is able to give you feedback and say, okay, well, what about this? Like, what if it's a day that I have sports? What if it's a day that I'm supposed to go to my friend's house? And you'll be able to talk through all of those solutions. And then when the time comes that your child does do that negative behavior, there's going to be less arguing because they know what the plan is. You've already talked to them about it. They know what to expect. It doesn't mean they're going to do it happily, right? Kids don't generally like consequences. But if your child knows what to expect, you're much less likely to have a huge power struggle when it comes down to setting the limit. Another thing to think of as you're figuring out this behavior plan is that you might have to revisit it sometimes, right? You may have to tweak the plan, something doesn't go well, and then you find another calm, positive time to sit down with your kids and say, that didn't go very well. What should we do different next time? And then you can also figure out if the behavior that your kid is doing is a can't do behavior or a won't do behavior. So if this is something that you want from your child and they just will not do it, that feels more appropriate for a behavior plan, right? Versus if there's something you're expecting your child to do and you figure out that they cannot do it, they do not have the skills to do it, then we're thinking less about a behavior plan and we're thinking more about, okay, what's on the bottom of the pyramid that's missing so that we can build that skill for your child so that when we do get to the point where that's the expectation, they are able to meet the expectation. All right, so we have talked about a lot of parenting skills around decreasing negative behaviors and setting limits and consequences. And there are other very important things about parenting, obviously, right? One of which is teaching our kids about healthy relationships. So we talked about behaviors. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the social part of social emotional development, and then we'll talk a little bit about the emotion part of social emotional development. Healthy relationships. I like this visual because these are all traits of a healthy relationship. Two-way communication, trust in the relationship, equality between both members, respect, and freedom, meaning one person doesn't have like control over the other person. So, what's important about teaching our kids about healthy relationships is that you are your child's best teacher. They are learning most of what they're learning about relationships from you. So that's from how you talk to other members of your family, maybe how you talk to your partner, how you talk to people at work. Your kids are always listening. I'm sure you all know that. And they will learn what healthy relationships are from you. That's what they've been doing since they've been born, right? The goal of teaching kids about healthy relationships isn't to shelter them from any unhealthy relationship in the future because we just can't do that. Your kids are going to come into contact with people who are not healthy people in terms of their relationships with others. The goal, though, is if we can teach kids what healthy relationships look like and feel like, then they will be able to identify those negative relationships when they come. So I want to be very mindful about what you have control over and what you don't. You don't have control over of every single person who comes into contact with your kids. But what you do have control over is teaching them what healthy relationships look like so that if somebody treats them badly, they get that feeling in their stomach that's like, ugh, that wasn't good. I didn't like being treated like that. That wasn't a healthy relationship. What we don't want for our kids is for them to be around so many unhealthy relationships that becomes their framework for what relationships look like. So the goal in terms of parenting, in terms of healthy relationships, is just setting that precedent so that they know what they deserve, right? This is just kind of a quick strategy for if you have any issues with like conflict in your home, for example. These are some strategies for modeling positive communication in the midst of a conflict. Basically, what this is teaching kids to use I statements. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that before. But it's basically if you don't like something someone is doing, instead of going on the attack and saying, why did you do that? That wasn't okay. It's shifting and saying, I felt this way when that happened and I didn't like it. I wish that this is what happened instead. So for a younger child, like 6 to 9, you might use a bug and a wish. It really bugs me when blank, when this happens. And I wish you would blank. And then the second person, who might be the caregiver, might say, yeah, I hear you. It bugs you when this happens. And this is what we're going to do about it. Sometimes you can't change what you're doing. So sometimes a kid might say, it really bugs me when you tell me that I have to ride my bike with my helmet on. I wish you would not tell me to wear my helmet. And you, as the parent, might say, I hear you. It bugs you when I tell you to wear your helmet. You still have to wear your helmet, but how can I tell you in a way that won't bug you? So even if you can't respond to what they want, do you see how this starts the conversation about, okay, well, here's the limit, but how else can we get your need met? And thank you for telling me that you didn't like it. An older child, like 9 to 11, might use more of that feeling language. I feel blank when you blank, and I wish you would or would not blank. So they might say to a friend, I feel hurt when you call me that bad name, and I wish you wouldn't call me that anymore. We can't control what their friend says back, right? But if your child is using this language at home, You might be able to say, "Man, I hear you that you felt this way when I said that to you, and I'm sorry. What can I say that's different in the future?" This is a great way to help kids learn how to problem solve and manage conflict in relationships because there will always be conflict in relationships. We just want to teach kids how to manage it. So, if we can teach them these quick strategies at home with us and teach them ways that it goes well, they'll be learning the skills. And so, if it doesn't go well in the future with someone else, they recognize, okay, this isn't about me, this is about them. All right. The last skill, I guess it's a skill, focus area for parenting healthy kids is emotion regulation. And I did not put this last because it's least important, but nonetheless, here it is. It is super, super, super important for us to be teaching our kids how to manage their emotions, obviously, right? So, an easy way to think about conceptualize emotion regulation is one, you're really helping your child identify emotions, right? You're trying to figure out how much they feel that emotion, and then you're figuring out what to do with that emotion. So, again, much easier said than done. But in terms of identifying emotions, some kids are better at this than others. Some kids have a harder time identifying emotions, especially when it comes time for figuring out how different feelings feel in their bodies. For example, if someone says they're anxious and another person says, "Yeah, I'm anxious too," what's actually going on in their bodies could be completely different. So, not only are we trying to teach kids what different feelings are and when you might have those feelings, but we're trying to tap into, like, okay, I hear you saying that you're scared. What does scared feel like? Are you breathing heavy? Is your heart beating fast? Are your palms sweaty? If a child is feeling sad, we might say, "Oh man, yeah, you do look sad. I see you don't have a lot of energy. You're kind of laying down. It kind of looks like you were crying before." So not only are we helping them identify the feeling, but we're helping them figure out, what does my body feel like when I have that feeling? I work with a 10-year-old who has a lot of social anxiety, especially around, going to school. And so with her, this looks like, okay, you walk into school, you're feeling anxious. What does that mean? When you say you're feeling anxious, does that mean you feel like you want to run away? Does it feel like your heart's beating really fast? And she might say something like, "Yeah, I feel really tense and it's hard to breathe, but I also can't think clearly. Like my thoughts are really foggy." And I'll say, "Oh my goodness, thank you for telling me that." Yeah. So when you're anxious, not only is your heart beating fast and you feel kind of panicky, but you can't even think clearly, right? So we're helping to kind of figure out the nuances of what these different feelings feel like. And then we ask, okay, would you say this is like the most anxious you've ever felt? Or is this like the middle amount of anxious? Or is this like way lower than what you usually feel? So not only are we helping them to figure out what the feeling feels like, but we're trying to figure out how much of it is there. And do they remember having more or less? Because then we can figure out what skill will work best. And then the third part, of course, is helping to figure out coping skills to attend to the emotion. This doesn't always mean the feeling will go away, right? But what this means is, like, it's okay to have this feeling. It's here, it's in your body. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to channel it into something else? Are we going to try to make it go away? Are we just going to kind of sit there and I'm going to be with you while it just slowly dissipates? And this is important for negative emotions as well as positive ones. So if you're focusing so much on what anger feels like in your kid's body, but you haven't spent a lot of time figuring out what calm feels like, then they won't know when they get to the calm state. So part of emotion regulation is, of course, identifying when they're having a emotion that they don't want in their bodies and what does it feel like, and where is it, how much do you feel it? But then as you're helping them to figure out strategies of what to do with that emotion, you're also checking in. Where's the anxiety now? Where's the angry feeling now? How much of the calm feeling do you have? What does that feel like? And hopefully your kid is able to recognize like how their body changes when they have more calm feelings. This is an example of a feelings thermometer, and there are so many different templates for this online, so you can fill in your own, you can look for one. But the idea of this thermometer is, on the left is numbers and colors, or maybe your kid is more of a would respond better to faces. So there's faces on the right. In the middle are feelings words. So you're helping your kid to develop their feelings vocabulary. One is happy, calm, pleased. As you go up, it might be nervous, it might be a little bit anxious. Then you go up more and it's frustrated, I'm getting annoyed, I feel sad. Then at this particular one, as you go up, that turns into angry and mad, and at the top is rage, furious. So when we're helping kids manage their emotions, we want to help them feel the different levels of those emotions and then what they need at each level. And this is going to be trial and error. But you might ask your kid, "Oh, I see that you're so calm right now. I see a smile on your face. You look so relaxed. What do you like to do when you're calm?" And you might write in some activities that they like to do when they're calm. And then you might find them later and they're feeling a little bit worried or a little anxious. You might say, "Oh, I see that you're feeling really worried right now. What do you need when you're worried? Should we try to write in your journal? Should we try to go for a walk? Do you want to go for a car ride with me?" So you're trying to figure out what your kid needs at each level. And as you go up the feelings thermometer, they're probably going to need more support from you. When kids are at a 5, they are not going to be able to access the part of their brain that comes up with strategies. So you may need to be their strategy at 5 until they can get to the point where they have used a skill enough that they can access it when they're out of 5. So we are not going to be focusing on screen time and internet today, but I did want to put this in here because your kids are at that age where they're starting to get phones or their friends have phones. They're getting on the internet more than they were before. So I'm just putting this in here so that you have these resources. I don't have a lot of experience with them personally, but these were told to me as good resources for limiting and monitoring your child's devices. I'm also not going to go into a tangent on screen time, especially because right now kids are getting so much screen time and there's sometimes not a lot we can do about it. A lot of kids are remote learning, a lot of us are working from home, and kids are having to be distracted. So I'm going to save that discussion for later because there are bigger fish to fry right now. But I did want to get this to you in case you're looking for any kind of ways to help keep your kids safe on the internet. So we have rpack.com, we have Bark, Net Nanny, Common Sense Media, and Seekadoo, which is a safe search engine. So I asked you at the beginning to think about what you want for your kids, what you want for your relationship with your kids. And then I asked you to, throughout this presentation, just focus on a couple small goals, a couple small takeaways, and put aside the rest for now, but just focusing on what feels good for me and my family. So take a minute and just think back on that and think about all the information that we just talked about. And if you could write down one or two things that you want to take away from this presentation today. Maybe there are things that you're already doing and you would just want to keep doing them. Maybe there are things that you've tried to do and you just want to do it more. Maybe it's something that you've never tried before and you're just going to give it a shot. So just take a minute. Research shows that you're much more likely to do something if you write it down. So write down 1 or 2 takeaways. And then I'm going to close on this slide. And this also goes back to what we talked about in the beginning of, there are so many parenting strategies. There's so many skills. There's just so much to learn about parenting. But if you're feeling overwhelmed, just go back to this idea of every child needs at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about him or her. What kids need the most from you is to know that you love them. Of course, there are all of these things that kids need for their development, but really what they need the most is to have a strong relationship with you as their caregiver. And so it's amazing that you all came here tonight and you're wanting to learn more about being good parents for your kids. And that just speaks volumes about how much you care about them and how amazing you are. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed, just keep going back to this point. What my kid needs the most is for me to just be crazy about them and just to love them and be there for them. And a lot of times the rest of the things will kind of sort themselves out because that's your lighthouse. So I just want to thank you all for being here. I'm sorry that I couldn't see your faces or see any of your responses, but I hope that this was helpful. And if any of you want to come back for the Q&A at 8:30, I will be here and I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you had about this presentation. So thank you.
So Brianna, this is Kevin Nichols. I apologize I wasn't able to join you early and start the session, but I had technical difficulties. But it looks like you did very well and took charge. I appreciate it. I wanted to say a few words to all of our attendees. I would encourage everybody to fill out our session evaluation. I put the link for that into the chat box. So if you could please look at that and give us some feedback on the session. And as Brianna mentioned, there is going to be a Q&A session at 8:30. So if you want to come back and have more conversation and questions for Brianna, you're more than happy to do that. I also wanted to say, there's a lot of great resources available through the Jefferson Center, and they're always open for accepting new clients. It's easier than ever to access care and get appointments, and so visit the Jefferson Center website at jcmh.org, or follow the Jefferson Center on Facebook. And let's see, I'm not sure, we have just a few minutes. I don't know if you'd want to answer a few questions, maybe a question or two now. Brianna, do you see the questions there?
I don't see in the chat box or the Q&A.
The Q&A, I think we have 3 questions. If you're not able to see them, I could always read them off.
Oh, I see them. Okay. All right, so I see one from Carolina. I don't really reward my son. I don't know if this is bad or good, but I feel that he knows what my expectations are regarding behavior and responsibilities. Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like, Carolina, and I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. It sounds like you are praising your son for doing good things, but you're not necessarily praising them for the specific behaviors. And it sounds like you have found what works in terms of taking something away to help with the behaviors. And it sounds like you said you hide the TV remote. He usually forgets and plays with his toys. So just think about, maybe this is working for his behaviors in the short term, and maybe that's all you need. But if you want to think about this long-term behavior change, that's when we're thinking more about how do we create a behavior plan where our kids are learning what we want to see from them. So you might have a behavior plan that extinguishes that negative behavior you don't want to see anymore temporarily. But if you want to try to create lasting change, then maybe just something to think about is creating more of a plan where your child knows what behavior you want to see and how he can earn back privileges by doing that positive behavior. Because then what we find is kids will start doing that positive behavior, sometimes to get back their privilege, sometimes to please you. But either way, they're learning that positive behavior, which becomes just more reinforced over time and they do it more. So hopefully that was helpful. I see one from Lisa. Yeah, you've already set up a system of consequences for bad behavior. How do you switch to a system of rewards? Yeah, that's a great question. I would say both. You're doing both at the same time, but that's a lot to say to you. But I do think that it is kind of both. But I think that your system for consequences for bad behavior should be very, very specific, a very specific behavior that they're getting some kind of consequence for, so that they learn exactly what that behavior is that you don't want them to do, versus kind of that reward system of praising positive behavior might be more general because you want to bolster all of those positive behaviors. But just keep in mind that principle of what you pay attention to will grow more. So either way, what you're doing with your behavior plans, the idea is that you want to be paying a lot of attention to the behaviors you want to see more of. So I don't know if that clarifies some of the behavior plan conversation that we are having, but really, however you do it in your house, the idea is, how do I get a structured way to pay more attention to the positive behaviors? And then those lingering negative behaviors, we can come up with consequences for them. But primarily, we want to be increasing the positive behaviors as much as we can. And then do we have time for one more?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I have Fatima. How best can parent react when children try to challenge family values? Yeah, that's a tough question. I think, first of all, it depends on what the value is that they're challenging and how important it is to you. Because if it's something that's hugely important to you, obviously that's going to be harder. And so my response would kind of change based on the nuances of this particular situation. But in general, it is developmentally appropriate for kids to start challenging family values. And what we learn, especially with kids who are more oppositional, is if we dig in our heels and say, nope, this is just the way that it is, they tend to get more defensive and be more argumentative. Versus if we're able to kind of foster that, like, yeah, you are questioning this. This is really important to us as a family, but you're not sure how that fits for you yet. Then your kid doesn't feel as defensive and they're just kind of able to explore that for themselves. Because really, when they become adults, if they move away, if they stay in the house with you, either way, they're going to be creating their own values anyway. But if we try to force a value on our kids, they might push back on that. But if we can just show them what our values are, why they're so important to us, and then help them figure out how that fits with them, a lot of times kids end up with similar values to their parents, but they just need to go through that phase of figuring out, what does this mean to me? Do I believe this? Is this a value for me? And sometimes if we push back on that, it gets messy, because then we end up in a power struggle over values, which we don't want to do.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of our time. Once again, thank you, Brianna. You gave everyone a very wonderful and interesting presentation. I want to thank everybody for attending today. And also, if you have a little bit of time between now and the next session that you're going to be attending, check out the expo hall at the virtual conference. And with that, I believe we're done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.